equipment in the shop. One is this. What is this? Circular saw is sometimes called a skill saw. Skill is actually a brand name, but it's come to mean this is a skill saw. So this is a battery operated one, and other ones have a cord on it. When you have a cord on it, there's always a danger of cutting the cord. Happens a lot, so battery ones you don't have to do that. This is the other one. So innocent. Such an innocent little thing. When I was about 20, I used to work at a place where they made the rubber doors that you drive through with a forklift. So the rubber on the bottom, but on the top you can see through it. It's plastic. We used to make those doors, and we'd cut them with a utility knife. And one time I was cutting with a utility knife, and I cut right down to the bone, all the way around there, just boom. So I went to the hospital for that. So, and another thing that I did where I have all my 10 fingers, so I'm the one that has set that saw stop off. We have a saw stop that if you put your finger in the blade, it'll stop. It'll crush on the blade and stop it immediately. I have stopped it twice. Not with my finger, but I was doing something that I shouldn't have been doing. One is I was cutting a circuit board. What's the problem with cutting a circuit board? It's got copper on it. So as soon as the blade senses the copper, it senses me, and it collapses on the blade, $70. Boom, just like that. Blade stops, collapses on it, takes 20 minutes to change it. Another time I was using you know how you often use a tape measure to measure from the blade to the fence? How you're going to set it? Well, the blade hadn't quite stopped spinning. And I got my tape measure in there, and I touched the blade, and boom, so nothing happened there. One where it was very dangerous for me, I was working in the shop when we were over in Muncie, and I was cutting on the table saw, and I was doing something that I shouldn't have been doing. Now this is often when actions happen. You're using the machine in the wrong way. I was using it to plunge cut. You know what plunge cutting is? That's so you can do it with a skill saw by starting like this. So you start up here, the blade's not in, and then you pull the guard back and you plunge into the, so you can't, there's no edge to start on. You have to start in the middle. So if I were going to cut a hole out of a board, I could plunge cut by doing that. That's called plunging. So on the CNC, when it goes down, that's plunging. Well, I was plunge cutting on the table saw. The problem is, you're doing it the wrong way. It's possible to plunge cut on the table saw. It's not advisable. Let's just look at what makes these machines so dangerous. Here's a saw blade, and you know, it's a round saw, and it's got these teeth that stick out like that. And this thing's going about 3,000 RPM. RPM stands for
Revolutions per minute.
how fast is that per second?
It would be 60 times that.
So 50. 50 times a second that blade is spinning. If you have 24 teeth on there, which is typical, so 50 times 24 is 120 or about. So 120 teeth in 1 second. A fourth of a second, that's 30 teeth. So if you're engaged with that blade for a fourth of a second, you got 40 teeth, that's going to do some damage. The way a saw works is, you have a table. Well, let me not draw it there because that's the wrong place to draw it. The table needs to be here. So typically with a table saw or a skill saw, you have between 1/4 and 1/2 inch of the blade exposed. You don't want that blade sticking way up there. It's just dangerous. You don't stick it up any higher than you need to. So 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Which way is that blade spinning? This way or this way? It's going this way. Why is it going this way?
So we can dig in.
No.
Because the blade's on the other side, if you were just to rotate it the other way, it'd only be hitting the backs of the teeth, not the cutting edge.
That's true, but why does it spin this way and not?
So the part goes away from
No.
So the teeth cut into the, what you're wanting to cut?
Really close.
So it doesn't do as much damage to the shaker?
Good one.
Rotation of torque.
No.
Mine's kind of that way a little bit, but it actually holds it down against the table as you're cutting, as
That's it.
opposed to going the other way, it's gonna wanna force
It
it.
is
force
pulling
it
the
up.
work into the table. The most important thing about it, it is pulling the work into the table. And that table is solid. So if you did it the other way, if that blade were going the other way, as soon as you came into it, well, you'd be on the back side of the blade. But you could turn the blade. Excuse me. Could someone give me some water? You could turn the blade around, spin it the other way, but then as you came into it, it would lift your piece up. So think about this, there's two parts. Right here is where we normally engage. We got our board, smaller board, we're coming in this way, and we're feeding it in that way. Rule number one, never have the piece engaged with the tool when the tool is running. In other words, you start away, start the tool, and then bring the piece in. Because you can lock the piece up. Like if you stick that board right where you want it, and then you turn it on, that blade could just grab it and flip it. So the blade needs to be running. Thank you. Oh, she even got my cup. Look at that. So this is a very important rule. With any tool, make sure that the tool is running before it engages the work. Jigsaw, miter saw, bandsaw, all of them. That tool needs to be running before the work gets in.
I saw somebody do that one time and had a fairly short 2x4, and they were trying to trim a little bit off the edge, and they had it actually touching there, and it did flip it up and actually almost broke their nose. I mean, just popped right into their
Yeah.
face.
These machines don't care about you. In fact, they don't even notice you. Cut your finger off, they'll just keep going, no crying, they won't have any remorse. There's nothing, none of that. They are machines and they'll do what they're built to do, and you will not stop them. You will barely even slow them down unless you do something really serious, in which case you might slow them down a little bit. So here's what's happening. I bring it into here, and as soon as it gets here, it starts taking a chip of that board and pulling it, throwing it down here. Now what I was doing, I was plunge cutting. So this would be the proper way to plunge cut. And I'm not suggesting you plunge cut, because this is an advanced technique. It would be to have the board here, and then to push it down onto the blade. Now there's a lot of things that are dangerous about that. Just do that normally. I was doing it wrong. I was doing it without thinking from here.
Oh,
What do you think happened? The piece got torn out of there, and of course it threw my finger into the blade. Now, I still have my fingers, it went right down to the bone. I drove myself to the ER, but I was lucky. Because it takes, a quarter second to cut your finger completely off. About 3 months ago, my son, who builds skateboards and does custom furniture, he's been doing carpentry for 20 years. He was making something for his son. It was a shield, like a character shield. Yeah, like that. He was doing that. And he was trying to hollow it out. And what he did was he even built a jig to hold it. So he was plunging the other way. He was plunging it this way. Now another thing about this, when you plunge that way, you can't see the blade. That's always bad when you can't see the blade. You should always be able to see the blade. That's another reason this is a bad idea. Well, he was plunging it this way, and the idea was that he's going to put it on there, down on the blade, and then rotate it, and get a nice little cup in there. Well, table saws aren't made for that. and he doesn't even know how it happened. He had a jig holding the thing in place, so it had to stay there, and it cost him 2 fingers. One there, and one there. Took it down, put it back on. That's after 20 years' experience. So don't do something stupid. You are especially, come on. Can you say something? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, and another thing that's just, you always have to be really careful with this when you're working with small pieces, small piece of wood. You generally don't take a small piece of wood and do it on a table saw. You can't control it. That blade is wanting to throw that piece all over the place, and you can't control it. So if I have a long piece, one is it's got some inertia, right? It's got its own weight. So as I run that into the saw, that saw is not capable of grabbing that thing and flinging it mightily because it's got some mass there. But if you have a little piece, it can easily throw it. And what happens when the saw throws something, it usually throws your hand as well. And it's often into the blade. So we've never had a serious accident here, except me. We get very little blood. You could measure the amount of blood we get every year. It's just minuscule out of people. But we want to keep it all inside. So these are some of the things. Now this applies to, this is a table saw. And that's what this is. This is a table saw. If you look at it that way, right? But it's movable. I have another friend, he was using one of these. You see this handle here? This is for your other hand. So you don't cut like this with one hand, because you have very little control of that thing. He was cutting something, I don't know exactly how it happened, but the saw got away and it cut like this, and it cut right up through the stomach. He's still alive. He was torn up. Still alive. So there's a lot of force, a lot of power there. I'm going to show you some videos of some things that have gone wrong. Did somebody have a question? Somebody got a hand up. Yes.
Does it have enough power to rip it completely out of your hand and just start going everywhere?
Absolutely. So I'm going to show you one where a guy used one of these wrongly. So what he did was, this is meant to be hand controlled, like this. What he did was, he put it upside down and he put it between 2 bricks. Oh. And he was feeding a board into it. I'm going to show you the video. Get the light behind. Here's the one. See how fast that happened? You have an accident, it happens so fast you don't even realize it.
Well, the other thing that's way wrong with what he's doing there is some tools don't have a keep the blade on all the time for a good reason, and this is one of those that typically you can't keep the blade. There's not a button that you don't have to be physically holding the blade for most of these. So he had to have rigged this that it was going to keep spinning, so there was no way to turn that off. Like I would guess that skill saw, you've got to manually be holding it down. There's not a button that you can push in that keeps it constantly engaged. So,
and most of these types of, there's like a safety on it. So this safety, see, I can't pull that trigger. I have to push that in with one thumb before it'll go. Now, something else I want to tell you about this. For the table saw, this doesn't have that much power, but there are bigger ones. There are up to 12-inch skill saws. That blade weighs maybe a pound, but you get it spinning at 3,000 RPM. Imagine if that came off the end of the nut, how far that would go. Well, all that momentum, that angular momentum is in that spinning blade, and it takes a lot to stop that blade. So it's got a lot of power, it can do a lot of damage before it gets done doing its damage. So that one was obviously wrong. What often happens, let's just talk about a table saw, because the table saw is really the big one. So in the table saw, you've got, I'm looking down on it now, you've got your table, your saw, this is the blade, and then you have the fence. That's called the fence, and the fence is adjustable. You can move it like this, sideways. So this is the width of your cut right here. And then you have a miter gauge, sometimes called a T-square, which can go, there's a slot here. And the T-square, which looks something like that, has a handle on it, and you can move it like this. So it stays in that slot, and it's perpendicular to the blade. So the fence is for ripping. So when you cut lengthways on a board, it's called ripping. So ripping, when you put the board this way, it's called a cross cut. So you could put like a 2x4 on here. Let's see, we have it. Yeah, okay, well, anyway. When you push it through like that, you're cross cutting that. Now, because that blade has got so much momentum, you never want to pinch that blade. Because what happens when you pinch the blade is you don't slow the blade down. Whatever you pinched it with becomes a rider, becomes a passenger with that blade. Because you clamped onto the blade and whoa, we're going with it. So what happens is a couple ways to pinch things here. One is if you don't use either the miter gauge or the fence and you're feeding it through freehand. It's really hard to steer straight. And what'll pinch it is if you turn it. So that blade is in one plane, it doesn't change. If you start making a cut, now you've got a cut in there, and then you don't go straight, you got a little bit crooked, it's gonna pinch that blade and that board is probably gonna get thrown up out of there somehow. So we always use either the fence or the miter gauge. Do we use both of them at the same time? I'm gonna say never. Never. Why? So this is typically when you want to use both of them. You've got this piece, let's put this back here where it belongs. Let's say right here. We've got that's our handle. We've got our board. We've got a long board here. And we want to cut it, we want to cut short pieces like that. So we want a bunch of those short pieces. So we set up our fence here, and then we take our miter gauge and we push it through. So what happens, when that gets a little ways in, you're not holding this piece and it gets caught against the fence because you're holding it here and you're holding it here. So that thing is just bound to get pinched. It's bound to get flipped out of there. The proper way to do that, there's a little trick to do that. I'll show you what it is. What you do is, you use a spacer. So I have a little piece of wood, and I put that piece of wood in there temporarily. I put this piece against it, then I take this piece away. So now it's not against the fence. This end is free. So if it gets cocked, it's fine. It's not going to pinch. So if you want, instructions, I can show you how to do that. That's a little trick to use. So typically, let's say we're just cutting with the miter gauge. If you're cutting with the miter gauge, let's say you're cutting, we're cutting this piece. You're typically going to hold that piece against the miter gauge. So you're going to actually grab it right here. Let me just mention this. That blade, that's the line of fire for that blade. it's gonna shoot this way. So you don't wanna be standing right behind that blade. You wanna stand over to the side of the blade. You stand over here. Out of the line of fire. Because if something gets pinched, that's where it's gonna go. And it's gonna go fast. Show you a little video. And this one is, you might think it's funny. It might be funny. So see if you can figure out what he did.
He got his hand in.
He picked that piece up before it was through the blade. On the back of the blade, which is lifting up, grabbed that piece and shot it and hit him right in the jewels. And he is not comfortable. So what's illustrated there is you're always using a push stick. Always push way through the blade. Don't stop with that piece partway in the blade. Push it all the way through. When it's way out the other side, then you can remove it.
Like there's your push stick on top of the light.
Oh, yeah. So here's the push stick. And if you don't have a push stick, it's real simple to make one. So this keeps me that far away from that blade. I'm down there, I'm pushing that piece, I'm supporting it. So if I'm cutting like this, let's say this board is this long, and I'm cross-cutting. I'm cross-cutting that piece. I'm holding it against the miter gauge here. Let me show you another video that illustrates this perfectly. What not to do. This is the one here. Watch it a couple times, see if you can see what he did wrong. This is what he did wrong. What's that? He's using both hands. That right hand has no business there. He's got the piece on both sides of the blade, and as soon as he gets mostly through, he's pinching it. He's pinching the blade. Now he was fortunate to only kick a little bit. But in that case, you hold on to the miter saw here, and you push it through here. You just let that piece go. There's nothing for it to jam against. It's not going to go flying anywhere. You push this through, and that piece will just fall off there. And you take it away. So he's going like this. Both pieces, he gets almost through. Now he's pushing on both sides. He's pinching the blade. The blade grabs a piece, and he was lucky. Still got his finger.
Is he holding both sides because it's already cut on the top, and now he's just cutting the other half on the bottom, which I don't know why you would do that either.
You wouldn't have to do that. Yeah.
You would lift the blade out further so that the blade.
You can see his right hand there. There's nothing wrong on that board. That's what's wrong. So oftentimes when you're, sometimes you get in a situation where you're cutting a board, and because the board is warped, like with the skill saw, you're cutting a board with a skill saw, and because the board is wet or warped or whatever, as you get in there, it is pinching that blade. It just, you release the tension in the board and it's pinching the blade. In that case, often you need to get in there when you get partway in and pry that crack apart. So it's to release the pressure on the blade. That's a special case, but something you can do. Okay, so this is the way we're doing cross cut. We're holding it with one hand, and this piece will it's fine. Now, if you were doing a rip cut, let's do the rip cut case again. And here we have just a fence, which locks in place. So it slides this way, and you lock it in place once you get it where you want it. You measure how wide you want your cut. Now in this case, depending on how big your board is, you're going to be pushing, let's just say, this is our board. Let's say this is our board. He's standing on the board. And you're gonna push that through. So, what you want to be, as long as it's sticking way out here, you can use your hands to guide it. And what you're doing is you're watching this line right here. You're watching the space between the fence and the board to keep it right up against that fence. You don't want to get it cocked. If you get it cocked a little bit, at some point, it's going to get pinched. So you're watching that. You're not watching the cut. You're watching this space. And as you get it in there, when you get that board, say to here, let's say it's now here. It's got this cut in it. There. Where our push stick, we're going to push on this one. So this one, I'm just going to carry the board along. I'm not going to put any pressure on it. But the push stick goes right here. Pushing right there to push that thing through. And I want to push it all the way through the blade. I'm not going to stop part way because that's when it gets pinched. I'm going to push it all the way through the blade. And if it's a real big piece, you're going to have someone on the backside catching it so it doesn't tip down, get lifted off the table. Because remember the principle we talked about, you keep the board on the table. The blade pulls the board into the table. Keep the board flat on the table. Don't lift it off there. Okay, let's see. Any other questions about the table saw and the skill saw? And you will always have a mentor there watching you do this until you become proficient at it, because it just takes a split second.
I know a guy that's a cabinet maker, and he was doing cross-cut, making the small pieces, and he was stacking them on the right side. One of the pieces ended up falling over, hitting the blade, hitting his wrist, and breaking his wrist. So make sure you keep, your material away from that blade.
So he got fed into the shooter. The shooter shot it.
Yeah, but he was just cutting, multiple pieces, and then stacking them too close to the blade, and then it tipped over and hit the blade.
There's just so much energy in that spinning blade. What it will do is unpredictable. So think. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, that's lathe. Any more table saw? Okay, let's just watch this. This is going to take a few minutes to watch this, but this guy goes through mistakes that you can make with a skill saw.
But I've always been nervous to recommend this tool to carpentry newcomers because it's so powerful, and there are so many ways to mishandle it. I'm going to do a lot of videos about the circular saw in the future, but right now I want to start off by discussing the 11 worst mistakes you can make and how to avoid them. That's coming up next on the Honest Carpenter Show. I'll mention real quick that I picked up a fresh circular saw for this video. It's a corded Makita, which I think is the best circular saw on the market. Makita did not send this to me. I bought this. I've always bought Makitas. It's all I've used since I was little because they're just the best all-around saw. I'll link some below in the description if you're looking for one. This model is just over $100 or over about $160 if you want the carrying case, which I still think is a great deal for such a quality tool. You can easily use this saw for 20 plus years if you just take care of it. That said, let's get on with our list. And we'll start off with the worst of the worst. Mistake number 1, getting in the cut path. The circular saw is basically like a freehand table saw. They have 13 to 15 amp motors, which spin a 7 1/4 inch blade at upwards of 5,000 RPMs. That is a lot of cutting power. A 12-inch miter saw has a similar yield with a bigger blade and fewer RPMs. So you get the same power in this little handheld saw as you do in that big bench-mounted saw. But the difference between the shop saws and this smaller one is that the circular saw has no fixed path. The only thing keeping your circular saw in line is your hand and your wrist and your arm. So it's capable of taking these huge lurches. The first mistake is putting any part of your body in its cut path. This includes putting your free hand in front of or behind the saw. Don't do that. Also, don't put your knee, leg, or foot behind the saw or in front of it. Always stand just to the side of the cut path when you're using the saw, and whenever possible, keep both hands on the saw. And don't reach beneath your piece when you're cutting. This can put your fingers in the cut path from below. Instead, use clamps to hold your piece steady and get your free hand out of the way. This is so important because it has a lot to do with mistake number 2, binding the blade. Blade binding occurs when a spinning blade receives too much pressure from the wood it's cutting through. I talked about this a lot in my most important word in carpentry video. Watch that video. It's the crux of everything we do when we're cutting. But in short, when the saw cuts a path, the blade sits in the channel it has cleared. This channel is known as the kerf. The kerf is a safe bubble for the blade to spin in. It keeps the blade free of contact with the walls of the cut. However, if you twist the saw while cutting, pressure will build against the blade. This pressure will cause the saw to kick and jump backwards out of the cut. This is why you have to keep appendages out of the cut path. Kickback can cause the spinning blade to leap at you. So, don't twist the saw while you're cutting. Keep pushing it in a perfectly straight line. Also, make sure your piece is supported near the cut. This will keep the cut line from collapsing. If you don't have proper support for the piece, it will bow as the saw passes through it. The bending material will begin to squeeze the blade, once again causing it to bind and kick back. In both cases, binding is caused by too much pressure on the saw blade itself. The motor bogs down and the saw leaps out of the cut. That's how disasters occur, so avoid it. This brings us to mistake number 3, failure to prop the cut. In order for a circular saw to work, the saw blade has to extend beyond the bottom of the piece you're cutting. This causes a problem because anything below your piece is in danger of being cut. You can't just cut flat on the floor or on your work table because you'll cut through those surfaces. You need to prop up your piece to cut it. The easiest way to do this is to just put some scrap wood beneath your material. You can space it so that your blade avoids the scrap blocks, but the saw is still firmly supported. Or you can place the blocks in the cut path and just let your blade pass through them. That's really the easiest way. You avoid some of the problems that spacing blocks underneath can cause, like unintentional binding when you space them too far apart. For some cuts, I even sometimes just hang the waste end off of my work table and make the cut like that. Gravity pulls the waste piece down, naturally preventing some binding. But this is trickier to do, and it gets dangerous if your waste end is too long, which creates a cantilever. If you need to cut near the center of the piece, you're better off propping it up. Make sure you have the most support directly beneath the weight of the saw, and that the material isn't bowing inwards. I often space blocks about 2 inches to either side of the cut path. Then I have extra blocks to support the far ends of the material. Nothing is likely to move or jostle this way. Mistake number 4, setting the saw blade too deep. As I said, the blade has to extend through the full depth of the piece you're cutting, but it doesn't have to extend too far. You should have less than 1/4 inch of exposed saw blade hanging below your material. More than this causes instability because it creates more blade surface that can bind up. Anything beyond 1/4 inch isn't helping. It's just increasing the chances of kickback while you're cutting. Also, keeping it at 1/4 inch guarantees that you aren't cutting too deeply into your prop blocks. This would just bog the saw down unnecessarily. And on that note, mistake number 5, adjusting the saw while it's in motion. To change your blade depth, you often just release a lever and swivel your saw plate up or down. I shouldn't have to say this, but don't do this while the saw is spinning. I see DIYers trying to make plunge cuts like this all the time, but I think that's a bad idea. The moving components are meant to stay locked during operation. That includes the bevel feature and depth set. Also, mistake number 6, don't retract a spinning blade. This is when you finish a partial cut and then yank the saw out while the blade is still in motion. You see this on job sites all the time, and I'll admit that I've done it more times than I can count. Pro carpenters are just always in a rush, and we come to overly trust our skills, but DIYers don't need to do this. Instead, wait a few seconds for the saw to spin down, then retract it. This will prevent binding that happens if you twist the saw on the way out. That would cause a really weird kickback. Also, you can easily screw up a good cut this way when the saw nicks the material. Keep those lines neat. Let the saw spin down, then pull it. Mistake number 7, removing the blade guard. Here's another completely ridiculous thing that I see on job sites, and something that I personally never do. Pro framers will often pin back their blade guards to keep them out of the way for fast cutting. Or they might remove them completely. Don't do this. They shouldn't be doing this, you definitely don't want to. The blade guard is there to prevent the spinning blade from contacting anything. It springs back the moment the cut is finished. Obviously, without the guard, the blade is more likely to cut you. But just as bad, if it lands blade down while it's spinning, it's going to run away like a road runner. I've heard of job site nightmare stories where runaway circular saws have cut off people's fingers and toes. Not worth it. Keep your blade guard on and make sure it works. If your guard stops working, it's time to retire the saw or at least install a new spring. Likewise, mistake number 8, don't set a saw blade down. This one is a little more of a gray area. You're never supposed to set a saw blade down just in case the guard didn't spring back. If it didn't spring back, it might go running. So instead, you're supposed to flip them over like turtles. I know this is good common sense, but it is hard to commit to sometimes when you're working. Doing this just makes them harder to grab because the handle is then upside down. If I'm not in the position to do it this way, I have some other options. The first and most important thing is that I check the blade guard before I put it down. I look at it after every cut to make sure that it's sprung back. This is just a good habit to get into. And I wait for the saw to spin down before setting it somewhere. It can't cause harm if it's not spinning. Another thing I do, seriously, is set it down in the open carrying case whenever I can. Other carpenters are probably going to say that I'm crazy for doing this, but I've always seen it as a great option. The case has a gully for the blade to sit in, so it's shaped perfectly. It's also soft, and it won't scuff the sole plate like concrete will. Never put a saw on concrete. It'll scratch everything it cuts afterwards. And since I tend to do my cutting in one place for a while, my case is typically right there beside my cut table. I just reach down and put the saw in it. If the case isn't there, I will sometimes set the saw on my lumber so that the blade hangs down over the edge. But this can be unstable, so I can't necessarily recommend it. Whatever you do, your best bet is to check the blade guard after every usage, let the saw wind down, then put it down. Safety first. Mistake number 9, starting up with contact. You should never spin up the saw when the blade is already in contact with wood. A lot of people try to do this when they're finishing off a cut. They make a partial curve in a board, then they have to change position to keep going. But when you're preparing to start up again, make sure you pull the saw back just a little bit so it's no longer touching wood at the front of the blade. Now you can start up your cut without contact. When the saw is spinning at full speed, gently continue the cut. Starting up with contact can cause the saw to buck up, which is how accidents happen. It can also damage the wood you're cutting or the saw itself because it has to start spinning with a lot of stress. The saw blade should spin up free of contact, then cuts can be made. Mistake number 10, cord drag. As you make a longer cut, like a rib, the cord on many saws can get hung up on the end of the board. It'll slide with you for a while, then suddenly it'll catch and stop the saw from moving. If it pulls too hard, it can twist the blade, and once again, this causes binding and kickback. As you're making your longer cuts, consider holding the cord in your free hand for a while until you can safely hang it off to the side. Make sure it doesn't trail and catch on the end of the board. You can also cause this problem by stepping on your own cord. So before I make every cut, I consider where the cord is and where it's going to wind up. I take care of that before I start cutting. Cord control is a big part of saw safety. And mistake number 11, forgetting trigger discipline. Just like when you're handling a loaded gun, you don't ever really want your finger on the trigger until you're ready to pull it. When you're carrying a saw around between cuts, keep your finger off the trigger. Just carry the saw with the rest of your hand, 3 fingers and your thumb. Grab the pommel with your free hand if you need extra support. Just don't use that index finger. After you've made your initial lineups, you can go ahead and put your finger in the guard. Pull the trigger and let the saw spin up. When the cut is finished, release the trigger and take your finger right back out of the guard. Keep it this way until you set the saw down or get ready to start another cut. It sounds obvious, but a lot of DIYers fire up saws on accident when, as I mentioned, they step on their own cords. The saw yanks down and they squeeze the trigger. This is easily fixed by just keeping your finger out of the trigger guard. So that's it, 11 circular saw mistakes and how to avoid them. As I said, I'm going to be doing a lot more circular saw videos in the future because they're so useful, but they're also dangerous. Always use extreme caution when you're working with circular saws. Don't use them for the first time without supervision and never handle them recklessly. In the end, you're entirely responsible for your own safety. That said, what did you think of the video? Was it helpful? Would you include anything I didn't mention? Please, let me hear about it down in the comments. Also, I'm going to link several circular saws down in the description.
Okay, comments on that. There is a table around here that has a cut in it. Everybody seen it? That's when they didn't space, they were cutting boards, and they didn't put spacers underneath it. So that's why we got the panel saw. The skill saw, we always had to use one to cut our big sheets, but it is precarious. You know, you're having to change your position because you're making a long cut, so you're having to move, you're having to do the cord and all that stuff. So we have a panel saw out here, which is a much safer option for cutting big boards. So any comments on anything he said there? Everybody knew all that? Did anybody learn anything? Okay, here's cable saw.
What are the worst table saw mistakes that you can make? I've waited a long time to do this video because it's super important and it's in the tradition of my 11 circular saw mistakes video. I'm slowly getting through the big three: circular, table, miter. And today we come to our large stationary workhorse, the table saw. These are the mistakes that I think are most important to avoid, along with some tips on proper usage. I'm actually going to start with some you might not think about much, and then finish with more common mistakes. But really, they're all equally important, so be sure to watch till the end. That's all coming up next on The Honest Carpenter Show. The first thing I'll say right off the bat is that I think you should always use a push stick. Many saws come with them these days, and there are numerous others on the market. I'll cover their usage soon and talk about some of my favorites. But for any rip width under a foot, you really should use a push stick. With that said, let's get into the list. Mistake number 1. Twisting the board. This is a cardinal sin with any spinning blade, and it applies to table saws as well, even if people sometimes forget that. Why do they forget it? Because the table saw has a really good fence. The rip fence sits parallel to the blade and guides the board on a straight path. This limits friction on the blade, so only the frontal teeth contact the board, and they can cleanly cut a path or a curve through it. But problems can still occur if the board gets twisted away from the fence. When this happens, friction increases against the rigid blade. The motor bogs down. If friction builds up too much, the blade may bind, throwing the board back towards the operator. It's like a catapult launching, and it's very dangerous. This is why you never want to twist the board while cutting. You always want to use the fence and keep the board moving in a straight line. Now, it seems pretty easy to keep a board against the fence, but beginners and even sometimes pros can actually run into problems with this. For instance, they might not have the inside edge fully flush with the fence at the start, and they'll begin driving at an angle without realizing it. This will leave slack at the fence, and if they swing the board to compensate, it may cause the blade to bind. Or they may be using a board with a ragged edge against the fence. That ragged edge creates gaps, which can make the board wiggle. Enough wiggle can also cause the blade to bind. You always want to use the fence, and make sure that your board has a clean, straight edge to push against the fence. This brings us to mistake number 2, cutting freehand. Freehand cutting is when you forego the use of the fence and just push the stock into the blade under hand guidance alone. Simply put, don't do this. It's such a terrible idea because it creates so many opportunities for twisting the blade. It's not easy to guide a board straight in by hand. It catches friction on the table, your hands may fight each other for control, and it all gets harder as your remaining stock gets thinner. In the end, you might create a seesaw effect between your hands. The board will twist, and the blade will bind. Don't freehand cut. Use the fence or a miter gauge. It makes everything about the cut cleaner, safer, and more effective. Mistake number 3, squeezing the cut. Working off the same principles we just mentioned, you also want to avoid squeezing the cut around the blade. And this is also possible even when you're using a fence. It sometimes happens because you're applying too much force with your outside hand. Beginners may try to guide their stock by pushing it forward with one hand and pushing it towards the fence really hard with the other hand. This may seem more secure to them, but really it's overcompensating. 1, your hand should never be very far forward on the saw. It should always be well on your side of the blade. And part of the reason is because it can create too much sideways pressure. As the blade passes deeper into the stock, the board loses rigidity. So too much outside pressure may squeeze the offcut onto the blade, causing it to pinch the blade and bind. So don't let your outside hand control too much. You can keep both hands pushing forward, but use only very light force from the outside hand towards the fence. The inside hand should be the dominant force, with the outside hand just helping it keep on track. This will also keep you from twisting the board, which is just as likely with this bad technique. Mistake number 4, ripping boards wider than they are long. Table saws are designed to make long, straight rips. They can be used for cross-cutting, but you can get into trouble more easily here. What frequently happens is that a beginner has a board that's shaped like this, and they want to make a cut across the narrow dimension, like this. So they'll dial their fence to the right width and start going through the cut procedure. They may do most things right, but still have a pretty high chance of messing up the cut dangerously. Why? Because this sideways shape is very unstable going through a table saw. It's only supported at one end, and you'll have a hard time keeping the narrow edge pinned against the fence. The issue is mostly friction. The long offcut will act like an anchor, pulling the piece diagonally. So you overcompensate by pushing that end forward, which again is hard to regulate. You'll get that seesawing effect between the two hands. As a result, both twisting and blade squeezing are likely. It's just a very unstable way to cut on the table saw. If you're going to cut a shape like this, maybe use a circular saw or a miter saw instead. Or if you only have a table saw, make a crosscut shape for it, like this simple one my buddy Steve Ramsey made. But be wary of cutting like this on the fence. Mistake number 5, levering. This is a fairly innocent mistake, but still one to be avoided. Levering occurs when you fail to keep a board flat on the table saw while making your cut. Very easy to do this at the start. If your piece is long or heavy, you may accidentally let the weight of the back tip the front up like a lever. You'll begin feeding it into the blade while it's off the table surface. This is dangerous because the wood might then lower suddenly onto the blade, causing a lot of friction and then kickback. Make sure you're keeping the front of your stock flat on the table. Give it a little up and down wiggle to feel for flush contact. Pin it down lightly with a finger, then slowly drive forward to initiate the cut. You need this surface stability all the way through the cut. Which brings us to mistake number 6, failure to catch the outfeed. This is basically the opposite of levering. Outfeed refers to the far end of the board that has passed over the blade and is exiting the back of the tool. The end of the board no longer has the full support of the table. So as more stock passes over, the weight of that end increases, pulling it downward. As a result, your end of the board gets levered upward, pulling it off the blade and table. This is really dangerous because it's possibly going to try to pull you forward towards the blade as you try to control the piece. You may lose your balance and fall onto the blade, or more likely, put your hand down on the blade to catch yourself. Can you imagine what a table saw blade is going to do to your hand when you push down on it with all your weight? It's horrifying. So, be sure to support your outfeed. Have a second person be there to gently catch it from behind, or create a platform that the outfeed can rest on, like what I did with my mobile station here. But if you're cutting something long or heavy, just be sure to have support back there. And that brings us to mistake number 7, pulling small pieces from the back. That last issue tempts many people to go around to the back side of the saw and pull pieces through from that side. But this can be very dangerous. You should never grab the far side of the piece with your hand anywhere near the blade. If you get blade binding, your hand will get pulled into the blade in the blink of an eye. This is how world-famous climber Tommy Caldwell lost his finger. And it almost always happens when you try to pull a really short piece from that side because your hand has to get so much closer to the blade. Now, I'll admit that pros in the field do pull from the back in certain situations, but only with very long stock and very carefully. I'll talk about it in a video soon, but it's really controversial and you should not make a habit of it, especially with smaller boards. Mistake number 8 is even worse, drop cutting. A drop cut is a cut that starts in the field of a board rather than the end. You can make drop cuts with a lot of tools. You might have seen me do it on this channel with circular saws and jigsaws, but you should never do it with a table saw. Drop cutting here will require you to do dumb things, like levering down onto the blade from the front, which I just talked about as a bad idea, or even worse, trying to lower a board onto the blade with your hands on both ends. Whichever case, the odds of getting board ejection are very high, because friction increases as you come down onto the blade. If your hand is behind it, as mentioned, it's going to get dragged forward very quickly. On top of that, it's almost impossible to see your cut mark because it's on the bottom. So guiding the board down precisely will be really hard. Just don't do it. Make your drop cuts with a circular saw or a jigsaw, and I'll do designated videos on that later. That ties in with mistake number 10, reaching over the saw. Even if you made a cut safely, there's still a lot of temptation to reach over the saw to grab the offcut. People do it because it's fast, but really, it's so dumb. If you reach over a spinning blade, there's a chance you might lose your balance and, once again, put your hand down to catch yourself. Or some article of clothing might get caught in the blade, which is why you shouldn't wear loose clothing around a tool anyways. Or you might drop a piece onto the blade and it'll get kicked right into your gut. I've seen video of this happening. I know it's possible. So, don't reach over the saw for any reason while it's running. If you have to, push the stock through and just let it fall onto something soft on the far side. That's so much better than reaching or grabbing from the back. Mistake number 11, ripping narrow widths. Some people want to create a very narrow piece, less than a ½ inch wide. So they'll bring their fence all the way over to the blade and start making passes. And while you can technically do this, it can also be very dangerous. For one, your push stick may not have room to get through this pass. And even if it does, it may bring something you're holding into contact with the blade. That's bad news. A push stick can get ripped out of your hand violently and even shatter. You're better off making that particular width the offcut, out at the far end of the board. It's harder to do a lot of rips that way quickly, but it's safer. There are tricks and ways of getting around this, and again, I will talk about them later. But at the very least, if you're going to do this, be very careful. Go slowly, try to keep your hands away from the blade, and don't squeeze the cut with pressure. It's easy to do that. And finally, mistake number 12, standing directly behind your stock. When you're feeding most boards through, you don't want to stand directly behind them. If they get ejected, they're coming straight through your body. Instead, you want to stand slightly to the side, so these boards will go by you harmlessly. This is really important with smaller, lighter pieces, because they can really go far. But you can reach just a little sideways with your arm to send them through with a push stick. That'll keep you safe. Also, don't cut too fast. That just builds up friction. Push at an even, steady rate, and listen for the motor bogging down. This all just becomes habit, and you'll start keeping yourself safe by instinct. And finally, as a bonus tip, don't set your blade too high. Doing that just exposes more heat. You only need the top of the blade about 1/4 to a ½ inch above your stock. Mistakes are much less profound at this blade height. Those are my top 12 table saw mistakes. I hope they were helpful. Please let me know what you thought about the video down in the comments. I'll link some table saws, blades, and push sticks down below, so check those out if you're interested. And I'm also writing books for kids these days, the Dungeon World books. They're available on Amazon too, so check those out as well. It's a great way to support the channel. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to check back soon for more videos coming up. And please consider subscribing.
Andy, go ahead. We have these safety instructions. There's one back there, one over there, one here. And then I have my hand, there should be one over there too. You all should read these instructions and understand them. We've only talked about the wood shop. I'm going to show you just a few videos. Most of the problems in the machine shop area, if you do it wrong, you'll end up breaking a tool or breaking the machine. There are a few machines over there that you can hurt yourself. Just like in here, the bandsaw. That bandsaw just made, you know, people that are butchers, that are cutting meat all day long. You don't meet very many that have all their fingers after about 15 years. So that bandsaw, you just cut your finger right off. We got 2 of them over there. There's one in here. Set the guard just above your work. Have just enough room for your work down there. You don't want to have a lot of blade exposed that you don't need. And now that, in that case, you're having to steer. And with the bandsaw, you always have to steer the wood as it goes through. So you're using both hands. Now the main difference between a bandsaw and like a circular saw or a skill saw is the blade is only like a ½ inch. So it doesn't have a lot of throwing power. All of its force is down, and it's a little bitty blade, so it's trying to pull that piece into the work. So if you twist it, you are going to jam up that blade. You can do that easily. But you can't use a fence usually on a bandsaw because the blade is so narrow, it doesn't have its own line. It'll just turn easily, so you have to steer when you go through there. The other thing that's dangerous is the sanders. So the sanders are moving a big belt along. There's 2 kinds in here. There's an orbital sander, and there's a pinch point that is on a sander. There's usually like a table that you can put a piece up against, and it'll sand the bottom of it. But right at the bottom of that, where the sanding belt is going underneath the table, that's a pinch point. You get your finger in there, it's just gonna like, send them down. Be really nice. It does your nails really nice. Does your fingers too. So don't get near that pinch point. Clothing. Very important you don't have loose clothing. These machines, especially the turning machines, they will grab that clothing and they don't even know you're there. They don't even know. Let me show you a video.
When you first stop,
Go up to it again. Put the key in the chuck, the machine gets turned on. See how it threw him over that machine
when
like
you first stop,
he didn't care
first
about it.
stop.
This guy is turning a big piece of wood.
Hard work, another day to work. Hard work, that's what they say. Hard work, earn my pay. Hard work, I get off the rock, I move on now. Hard work, another day to
The wood
work.
split.
Hard work, that's what they say.
He was in the path.
Hard work, earn my pay. Hard work, I get off the rock, I move on now.
See, with the lathe turning, there's a throwing path there, right next to the head. So if something comes off there, it's gonna go perpendicular to the rotation, flying off. What usually happens is that someone will leave the key in the chuck. Never leave the key in the chuck. What happens if the key is in the chuck and you turn it on? The key becomes a bullet. And it'll throw it all the way across the shop. It'll hit the back wall. If no body intercepts it first. So if you leave the key in the chuck, you're gonna be off the lathe for a week. If you do it a second time, you will not use the lathe again. Roman.
So, the wood incident actually happened to me and my teacher when we were first testing our CNC lathe. But luckily it has an enclosure, so all it did was scuff the acrylic really bad.
Okay.
So, it happens, and it's really, really scary. Especially when it doesn't end up hitting us.
So just with,
It's right now.
Now, he was strong enough and his shirt was weak enough that he didn't get pulled in there. Steve had another video, and I couldn't find it, where the guy is polishing a long bar on a lathe. And he's doing like this, and he gets caught in it, and he actually his body ends up spinning around that thing. Yeah. What were you gonna say?
so I was just gonna say, for absolutely anything you do, anything that has anything sharp, anything dangerous, the concept of line of fire should always be in your mind, right? If you're cutting something at home with a knife, you're opening something, you're cutting something, you should always be thinking about where is the energy moving, where can it go, and this will get you out of a lot of trouble. So almost everything they've gone over tonight, this isn't really line of fire, this is just don't wear loose clothing. But those boards getting kicked out, he was in the line of fire. So many of the items, it's just being in the line of fire, whether it's your own strength, the strength of the machine, whatever it might be, to always think of the line of fire, where is the energy gonna go, and could it hurt me, should be what you're thinking about every time you do anything with anything that could possibly hurt you.
What do the Boy Scouts say? Right now? Always cut toward your buddy. Cut toward yourself. Cut toward your buddy.
I've never heard
Don't
that.
cut toward yourself.
And I'm English. I've never heard that.
You haven't? You're not old enough yet. Any other questions on this? If you have any questions about something you're doing, ask. Don't just say, well, I hope this works out all right, because it won't. Okay, any questions? Okay, break time.